Semester number 2, lesson number 36. Our aim today is how did the Civil Rights era progressively bring about equality in the United States? All right. And, as we talk about today's lesson and yesterday's lesson, I think the main goal is that we realize the progression that has made place in terms of minority groups, most specifically African Americans in the United States. And, we could draw this all the way back to the early 1800s where they were enslaved and their slow, arduous process to become fully established American citizens. And that's what we're going to focus on today, and we're going to really look at some big people and some big court cases. The first thing I want you guys to do right now at the beginning of class is to read The Ballot or the Bullet and I Have a Dream. The Ballot or the Bullet's by Malcolm X, and I Have a Dream is obviously by Martin Luther King. And I want you to create a T-chart to show the differences between the ideologies of these two civil rights activists, all right? Because Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, although they kind of had the same goal in mind, all right, this goal of African American, and minority rights, the way in which they wanted to achieve that goal was very, very different. So take a second and read those over. They are very good, all right, and we will go over that in class. Today we're going to talk about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X to begin. Then we're going to talk about some Supreme Court cases. And lastly, we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the first thing we're going to look at is Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Although they were both fighting for very similar goals, they were fighting in a different way with a different end game. Martin Luther King, obviously, very passive, right? He believed in pacifism, and if he wanted to make a statement, he would do so through civil disobedience, breaking laws that he believed were unfair, and in doing so, all right, would bring about notoriety. Martin Luther King believed in integration, the combining of the minority cultures and the quote-unquote Protestant white American culture, all in the concept of African Americans and white people living side by side. He was the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he was assassinated by James Earl Ray, who was a white Southerner. All right, and Malcolm X, on the other hand, he wasn't as passive. Not at all. He was not one who believed that peace was the way to drive change. He believed violence if necessary. All right, and his big slogan is by any means necessary. And Malcolm X believed more in a segregated society and really showing the power of the African American community rather than giving into the white community. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he was assassinated by his own people when they believed he had gotten too powerful. All right, two similar men in their fight for African American equality, but very different in their beliefs on how and what to do with this equality. All right, and right here is a telegram from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X's wife after his assassination, because Malcolm X is assassinated first. While we did not always see eye to eye on methods to solve the race problem, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had a great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem. He was an eloquent spokesman for his point of view, and no one can honestly doubt that Malcolm had a great concern for the problems that we face as a race. So although these two were not, in any way associated and were very different in their beliefs, Martin Luther King very much respected Malcolm X, and I'm sure it was, the other way around as well. And this is the only documented picture of them meeting. All right, obviously Martin Luther King is on the left, Malcolm X is on the right. Point number 2 is the Supreme Court cases. So how did African American lives change because of the Supreme Court? And we're going to go backtrack all the way back to 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson. All right, and Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that declared separate but equal was legal and constitutional. This allowed for black and white schools, bathrooms, water fountains. So basically, it was legal segregation or legal separation. It allowed for African Americans and whites to be separated, legally, as long as both were given, their necessities. And although they said separate but equal, you know, if you think about it, who do you think had the better schools? Who do you think had the better establishments and whatnot? All right. And Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954, 58 years later, reverses Plessy versus Ferguson, because they realized that by making things quote unquote separate but equal, you are really making everything unequal. And nothing that the African Americans had was anywhere near what the whites had. All right. So Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954 reverses Plessy versus Ferguson, and segregating public schools led to unequal education. Therefore, segregation was illegal and had to be changed. All right. These are two Supreme Court cases that come up a lot on the Regents. So please ensure that you understand these. The third point we're going to look at today is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was passed in an effort to correct racial and gender discrimination. All right. It outlawed major forms of discrimination against racial, ethnic, national, and religious minorities, as well as women. It was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. And really what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does is this really brings the country into a system where everyone is equal, regardless of their race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, or their gender. And this is a big, big step in American history. For something that we've learned about has been a male-dominated society, this really changes the way in which things are, you know, looked at. And here's the signing of the Civil Rights Act, and look who's front and center behind Lyndon Johnson, all right, Martin Luther King Jr., who I believe, you know, obviously he was very happy about this, but he knew that even though this had been signed, you know, more changes still needed to be made, and, you know, you still had to continue to fight for this equality. We will talk more on this stuff tomorrow. Have a good night.